Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Jayant Bhandari. He's been with us a couple of times. He's a world traveler. In fact, he just came back from traveling in Asia. He was in the UK, in the Middle East as well, and now he's traveling around the United States. He invests around the world in various places, but he's has a little different perspective than Harry Dent, who was just on with us a moment ago. Very interesting things Harry had to say, and Jayant also a world traveler, a very well-educated person who invests in a lot of gold mining exploration stories, some of which I'm also invested in. So welcome. Thank you for joining us again, Jayant.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Just good to have you with us. You just came back from Asia, and I know that you said that you had heard some of Harry Dent's remarks concerning India. Harry, of course, approaches investing in a different way, but he's looking at India as a bullish place to be, not right away, not now, but India and Southeast Asia, and he's very bearish on Japan, but you were telling me right before we went live that you don't quite agree with those views.
So, Jay, I try to go to Japan and China at least 3 to 4 times a year, and I'm back in India at least 3 to 4 times a year. Now, here is a big issue with India. If I want my maid to bring me a cup of coffee, very likely it will either be cold or the cup will not have been cleaned properly. It is virtually impossible to find skilled people in that country. And I'm talking about the very basics. If I want to manage a manufacturing operation of 5 people, consider it impossible to find 5 people to work in your factory. And that is the real problem with that country. People have no skills. The country is a complete chaos. Nothing works in that country. Even the airports get degenerated, degraded, and start to fall apart within a few months after a new airport opens up. Because the problem is that no one in that country can actually maintain and fix things. And that is really the cornerstone problem of that country, and you can't remove that problem in a few generations. India is stagnant today. Economically, it has reached its peak already, and my guess is that India is on its way to implosion right now. For sure, you can be sure of one thing, that there is no bright future of India.
Wow, that's coming. You're a native Indian, so you certainly have a perspective. You've lived there for a long time. Although you don't live there all the time now, I guess you go there a few times a year, you said, right?
I visit India for my professional purposes. I don't necessarily invest in India, but I like to still go and see all these poor countries to get a perspective on what is actually happening in those countries. And yes, I visit India whenever I'm flying in Asia.
Well, how do you account for that? The idea that they can't fix anything. I mean, what is there about the Indian people? They're not stupid people. They're very bright. You have some very good engineers. You have some people that are able to do things. I mean, it's mathematicians and software engineers and so forth. A lot of very smart people in India. How do you account for this issue that you're talking about, lack of ability to do these sort of common things?
And that is actually what is making India and many of the third world countries worse rapidly, because the very best people from these countries continue to move to the Western society. So what you come across, Jay, on a daily basis is the tail end of the bell curve people from India and Africa, the very best people from these societies. And that has been a brain drain for these third world countries. And increasingly, you don't have leaders in those countries. And that is actually a massive problem for that country. Now, just because you look at the tail end of these people does not mean that the bell curve the tail end represents the bell curve. The very best people are here and the leftovers are left in India.
Hmm. So what you're saying, the brain drain, if there wasn't that brain drain, then there could be an improvement perhaps within India.
Well, a slight improvement. The problem is that India is culturally a tribal society. It's culturally a chaotic society where people don't really understand the concept of tomorrow. They don't understand the concept of commitment. They don't really have the work ethic. And you have to understand that the British and the Christian missionaries tried to change cultures of these societies over several centuries, and all they achieved was a small, minor improvement in the way these societies worked. If you think you can change cultures of these societies in a millennia, you are very optimistic.
All right. Well, there's certainly a different view than Mr. Dent has for sure, and that's coming from someone who knows a lot about India. That is yourself. So it's very interesting. Well, you've just come back from, what about Singapore? It's a little different story. Singapore, how does Singapore, they've been very, very vibrant, a very prosperous city-state there. And how will Singapore hold up? Do you see a lot of changes taking place in a more dominant Chinese society in Asia? So do you still see Singapore as being Jim Rogers, for example? A lot of wealthier people have gone to live in Singapore because it's a relatively free society, I guess, compared to a lot of others anyway. So what are your comments about Singapore? You just traveled there, I believe.
Absolutely. I go to Singapore quite a bit. Actually, I spend a fair bit of my time in Singapore. It is the best run society on the planet. People should go and try to live a bit of their time in Singapore to understand how well that country is run. When I arrive at the airport, my bag is invariably on the carousel before I arrive to the carousel, and I'm out of the airport in about 10 minutes after my plane lands. This is how quick that society works. It's extremely efficient. I take the public transportation from the airport to get to the city, and it costs me about $1.50 American, or probably less than that. It's clean, it's air-conditioned, and it's not noisy at all. People in public spaces in these societies in East Asia do not talk much, because they know they trouble other people when they talk too much or they watch too much of their smartphones in public space. And that is the high quality that you get in East Asia, right from Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. Japan is one of the best societies on the planet.
Well, that's, again, an opposite view of Harry Dent's, but very, very interesting. So you were in China, too, you said. You said, how much time did you spend in China? And then you were in Hong Kong. How much time did you spend in China, and what are your observations of China?
I was in China for about 8 days. I was in Changsha, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. And Changsha is and I like to go to a new place in China every time I go there. Changsha is a 7 million people city. You take bullet trains everywhere in China these days, Jay. You go to a train station and there's a bullet train departing every 2 minutes or every 3 minutes. Now, it's almost impossible for Western people who have learned to think that China is a paper tiger to go and actually see this society in motion, the bullet trains, the airports, how aggressive and energetic the young people in in China are. Changsha is full of young, energetic people, modern buildings, modern infrastructure. I travel in public transportation all the time, and I was probably the only non-Chinese in Changsha. Perfectly safe. I could walk around late into the night. No one tries to fool me, hassle me, or cheat me. And that is where China is going. It is truly one of the most and the best emerging societies on the planet, and the only third world country that is emerging. And in my view, it will continue to emerge over the next few decades. Remember, Changsha is almost like the backwater city from Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Mm-hmm. So development is now going sort of westwards from Shanghai, Beijing, all the way west very slowly. And this will continue over the next few decades.
China. So, I mean, there's not as someone said, my good friend Chen Lin said, as long as you don't voice your opinion about politics and just stick to your business, you'll be left alone, and you can do quite well in China. That was his view. You agree with that?
I completely agree with that, Jay, and I have a huge respect for Chen Lin. He's a friend of mine. Now, we are not really comparing China with the perfect society on the planet. Mm-hmm. There is no perfect society. Every society has its problems. Singapore has its problem. Hong Kong has its problems. China has its problems. But remember, Jay, a lot of Americans think very proudly about the freedom of speech that America has. They don't really understand that there's something called political correctness. You fall out of line of political correctness in America and see your career and social relationship get destroyed in minutes. People will shun you. You will be fired from your job. So,
absolutely. But it hasn't always been that way, to this degree anyway, Jayant. And I mean, I'm 72 years old. I've seen these changes you're talking about. There was a time when the left side of the political spectrum would stand up for the Nazis' right to speak out. I think once they've gained their power, they've sort of given up on some of that objective free speech issue. But in any event, you're right. There's no society that's perfect. But I want to ask you about the Hong Kong situation, because obviously there is that conflict. The people in Hong Kong have been used to, having lived under the British, a bit more freedom of speech with respect to elections, the politics of their country. How do you see that situation being resolved between China and Hong Kong?
It is an unsolvable problem, really. It will be, I don't see how that problem will get resolved. And the problem is that China can no longer let go of Hong Kong. I think ideally China should never have accepted Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a completely different society institutionally and politically. And Hong Kong will create a lot of problems for China. If China gives in to the demands of Hong Kong, it will unleash a democratic movement in China now. And at the same time, Hong Kong people will not stop fighting, because they are not Chinese who existed in Tiananmen Square in the 1970s and 80s. The Hong Kong people know how to fight, and they are not indoctrinated into existing in fear. So they will keep fighting. Now, here's another problem. People in Hong Kong are fighting for democracy. Democracy will make Hong Kong a populist country, and it will destroy Hong Kong for what Hong Kong is. So there's just no good solution to the current problem. I have no clue how it will get sorted out, although I have a huge amount of respect for people in Hong Kong. I was with protesters for hours, and I have a huge amount of respect for how civilized they are, how well they are fighting with the Chinese government, and they should fight with Chinese government. And at the same time, I actually quite like China. And I think Hong Kong people have to accept that China is a big backbone for the economic growth of Hong Kong. So I like all these people. I'm a mere spectator. I hope Hong Kong can somehow finds a way to exist the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one country, two policy perspective seems to be what maybe is at risk now. And I know in talking to Chen about this a week or so ago, he was suggesting that he thinks that the Chinese may crack down. They may institute a more stern policy towards Hong Kong after the January 11th elections in Taiwan. That he thinks that maybe the Chinese are taking it a little more soft. They're being a little more soft on Hong Kong now until after those elections. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't think that will happen. China has mostly stayed away from interfering in Hong Kong. Whatever has happened in Hong Kong happened because the head of the government of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has been trying to curry favor with Chinese government. She's been trying to be kowtowing to Chinese government for her personal benefit. Chinese has, from what I see, taken a mostly a distant approach to interfering in Hong Kong. If China interferes in Hong Kong, it will create a very bad name for China, something that Chinese government does not want. So I don't think Chinese government will necessarily get involved in physically trying to control what's happening in Hong Kong, but also because Chinese government knows it can't win a war with 6 million people. I mean, you can send PLA if there's a guerrilla army all over the country. How will you win a war? So I think China will stay away from getting from interference in Hong Kong.
And you've switching to the Middle East. You've traveled there a little bit, Abu Dhabi, and what are your thoughts about what's going on in the Middle East? And do you see things changing there dramatically in terms of geopolitics? Less of an influence, perhaps, of the U.S. in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, I'm in favor of U.S. influence in the Middle East. If you don't have U.S. presence in the Middle East, and if you don't keep this horrible dictator in Saudi Arabia in power, you will actually see emergence of a much worse dictator in Iran. So you have to have U.S. presence in the Middle East. But I'm very happy that Trump is pulling out of areas like Syria and Iraq and trying to pull out a bit from Afghanistan, areas which don't offer an immediate threat to the U.S. But Iran is still a threat, and America should stay put in Saudi Arabia to keep Iran in check. What is interesting is, Jay, I go to the Middle East at least once a year, and I go there only during the winter season because it's so hot otherwise. And what I've seen recently is that the malls are getting rapidly empty in the Middle East, in Bahrain, in UAE, in Oman. And the problem is that these countries, Saudi Arabia, I haven't been to Saudi Arabia because you can't go there yet, recently imposed 5% sales tax on sale of goods. And because of just that 5%, the Middle East has lost its competitive advantage in terms of attracting tourists buying their goods. And that is how fragile the Middle East is, and oil price isn't really helping them much. I think the Middle East is a palace of cards, and it will fall over unless oil prices improve rapidly.
Well, that obviously we're just about out of time here with only about 2 minutes left. What do you think that portends then? I mean, Harry Dent is very bearish on gold right now. The global markets, I think you would agree that we're in a financial market bubble. With 2 minutes left, what's your outlook for gold and gold mining shares right now? If you could just give us a quick take.
Not many people have an option to protect their wealth outside investing in gold and silver. The problem is you can't trust your own stock market in the Western countries or certainly in the third world countries. The only option you are left with is gold and silver. And that is where I think a lot of people with wealth will be using to protect their savings going forward.
Well, it certainly has been true that gold has protected savings, and prices decline relative to gold, but not relative to the dollar. So I'm not sure. They did briefly in 2008, but that wasn't very long lasting. One more quick one. I see we still have another minute. Novo Resources, one of your favorites, I think. It used to be anyway. It's still a very interesting story. I know that you've been over there with Quentin Henning. You visited the property. With 1 minute, what are your thoughts about Novo?
Well, I am a big fan of Dr. Quentin Henning and all the companies that he manages. Miramont, Novo, Irving Resources. I'm a shareholder of these companies, and I think all these three companies continue to have a very good future. I have been to his project in Australia several times, and I see a massive improvement every time I go to his projects. More people doing more work at the projects, and I see a bright future for Novo Resources.
Very good. Yeah, that dry separation technology looks very enticing and looks like it could be very, very important for that project. Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Jayant, and we should do this more often and get your take on various places around the world, given your international travels. That's very much appreciated. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Jay.